Welcome to the all-new True Crime Never Sleeps podcast with your host, Larry Leese. Join us every week this season as we dive into the life and crimes of serial killers, from the butcher-baker Robert Hansen to the Golden State Killer Joseph D'Angelo.
Hello listeners, welcome to another episode of True Crime Never Sleeps. Crime and criminal psychology are of great interest to people. Someone who has had a good knowledge in criminal psychology would most of the time be interested in crime as a subject matter of study. But today we are going to hear about a serial killer who did his studies in criminal psychology. BTK, the famous serial killer. And today we are going to discuss the life of Dennis Rader, who lived on the outside, hiding his dark secret, which he was so desperate to reveal by dropping breadcrumbs to the media. He was not a little guy who was an easy job for the police. He eluded police for 31 years and was finally caught in 2005. This is his story, and wondering what BTK is, it stands for bind them, torture them, and kill them. Rader was born on March 9th, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and grew up in Wichita. He was the oldest of 4 sons. He enjoyed a seemingly normal childhood, reportedly masking such disturbing behavior as hanging stray animals. Rader dropped out of college and joined the U.S. Air Force in the mid-1960s. After returning to Wichita, he married his wife Paula in 1971 and worked for an outdoor supply company for about a year. In 1974, he began a lengthy stint as an employee of ADT Security Services. And to really hammer in the family man image, he was also serving as the president of the Christ Lutheran Church Council and a Cub Scout leader. But that picture-perfect facade may have been the exact image he wanted to relay as he covered up some of the most gruesome murders in American history. The possible reason can be, as a child, he had developed violent sexual fantasies that included bondage after killing animals. And on January 15th, 1974, he turned to his first murder spree, killing the parents and 2 kids of the Otero family, and then following up by murdering Catherine Bright in April that year. He had known both Bright and Otero mother from his time working at Coleman Company. In a cruel twist of timing, it was 4 years later that Rader graduated from Wichita State University, studying what else? Criminal justice. And it was that kind of double life that led to his carefully orchestrated crime spree, which lasted from 1974 to 1991. In all facets of his public-facing life, Dennis Rader appeared to be just a regular guy. Now, on the afternoon of January 15th, 1974, 15-year-old Charlie Otero and 2 of his siblings came home from school to find a horrific scene. Their parents, 38-year-old Joseph and 33-year-old Julie, and their 2 youngest siblings, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine, had been brutally murdered in their Wichita home. The murders shook the small Kansas community, but the killer wasn't immediately found. Rader struck again a few months later. On April 4th, 1974, he waited in the apartment of a young woman named Catherine Bright before stabbing and strangling her when she returned home. Rader also twice shot her brother, Kevin, although he survived. Kevin later described Rader as an average-sized guy, bushy mustache, psychotic eyes, according to a Time magazine article. In October 1974, Rader placed a letter in a public library book in which he took responsibility for killing the Oteros. The letter ended up with a local newspaper, and the poorly written note gave authorities some idea of who they were dealing with. Rader wrote, quote, "It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversions. Hang up." He warned that he would strike again, noting, quote, "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. The initial struck and the murderer came to be known by variations of the BTK killer moniker, or simply BTK. Rader's next known crimes occurred in 1977 in March of that year. He tied up and strangled Shirley Vine after locking her children in the bathroom. In December, he strangled Nancy Fox in her home, and then called the police to report the homicide. Shortly afterward, in January 1978, Rader sent a poem to a local newspaper about the killing. Several weeks later, he sent a letter to a local television station stating that he was responsible for killing Vian, Fox, and another unknown victim. He also made allusions to several other notorious killers, including Ted Bundy and David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. Despite his cat and mouse games with authorities, Rader was able to keep the lid on his secret, murderous life. Reportedly an attentive husband, he and his wife had a son in 1975 and a daughter in 1978. The next year, Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in administration of justice. Still, he continued to taunt authorities and appeared to be poised to strike again. Adding to the horror of Rader's murders was his constant toying with authorities, starting with that note left in a library book. Wichita Eagle newspaper employee Don Granger received a phone call in 1974 revealing that the letter was stashed in one of the books. Granger immediately let officials know and the police found it, yet the contents of the letter weren't revealed until a new weekly newspaper, the Wichita Sun, which had only launched a few months before that, got their hands on the letter. A portion of the letter said, quote, "I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurts me as well as society. It's a big, complicated game. My friend the monster play, putting victims' numbers down, follow them, checking up on them, waiting in the dark, waiting, close quote. About 4 years later, on January 31st, 1978, the Wichita Eagle received another note, this time in the form of a poem, starting with the words, quote, Shirley Locks, quote, on an index card about the murder of Shirley Viant, killed the previous March. Around the same time, the Eagle got another letter about the Turo murders, and the TV station KAKE got a letter referring to the killings of Fox and Vian, slain in December of 1977, as well as another unnamed victim. He reportedly drew pleasure from the media coverage, even expressing in one of his letters, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" In April 1979, Rader waited in an elderly woman's home, but left before she returned. He sent her a letter to let her know that BTK had been there. In an effort to catch him, the authorities released the 1977 recording of his phone call to police, hoping that someone might recognize the voice. After several years without a known crime, Rader killed his neighbor, Maureen Hedge, on April 27, 1985. Her body was found days later on the side of the road. The following year, he killed Vicki Wergel in her home. His final known victim, Dolores Davis, was taken from her home on January 19, 1991, and it was around the time of the 30th anniversary of the Turo family murders that Rader started to drop hints once again. With many news stories marking the 30th anniversary of the Turo murders, BTK resurfaced in 2004. Rader sent local media outlets and authorities several letters filled with items related to his crimes, including pictures, a word puzzle, and an outline for the BTK story. He also left packages with clues, including a computer disk that ultimately led authorities to Rader's church. Investigators also noticed his Jeep on security tapes of some of the package drop-off areas and cemented their case by obtaining a DNA sample from Rader's daughter. Rader was arrested on February 25, 2005, and later charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. His neighbors and fellow church members were stunned by the news, unable to believe that the man they knew was the serial killer that had haunted the area for so long. Rader pleaded guilty to all the crimes on June 27, 2005. As part of his plea, he gave the horrifying details of his crime in court. Many observers noted that he described the gruesome events without any sign of remorse or emotion. Because he committed his
If you enjoy the true crime stories featured on this podcast, please consider supporting us by buying us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. Your support helps us grow the show. Thank you for being a listener and supporter of the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast.
crimes before the state's '94 reinstatement of the death penalty, Rader was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility to serve his 10 life sentences. It would be interesting to know how the police cracked the case. The whole process was something not less than a great effort. Rader thought he had some sort of understanding with Wichita, Kansas Police Lieutenant Ken, head of the multi-agency task force that was trying to catch him. In the weeks before his arrest, Rader had asked police whether he could communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced to a particular computer. Police responded by taking out an ad in the classified section of the local newspaper as Rader had instructed, saying, "Rex, it will be okay to communicate via floppy disk." A few weeks later, such a disk from BTK was sent to a local television station. The disk was quickly traced to Rader through a computer at his church. DNA testing soon confirmed that Rader was BTK. It is interesting to go through the words of the lieutenant who arrested and had the presence of mind to divert Rader into the trap which they had set. Quote, "Him sending that disk is what cracked the case. If he had just quit killing and kept his mouth shut, we might never have connected the dots." Rader was still smarting about the apparent betrayal in the hours after his 2005 arrest, expressing shock at the fact police would intentionally deceive him and saying he thought he had rapport going with the lieutenant, whom he referred to by his first name. The lieutenant then recalls he couldn't get over the fact that I would lie to him. He could not believe that I did not want this to go on forever. Rader referred to the floppy disk again later in the interrogation, saying he knew he was taking a big gamble by sending it to the TV station. "I really thought Ken was honest when he gave me the signal it can't be traced," he said. "The floppy did me in." The idea going into the interrogation was to get Rader talking and keep him talking. At first, Rader tried to play a cat and mouse game with detectives, talking in hypotheticals and referring to BTK in the third person. But once he realized the jig was up, he gave a full confession, recounting in chilling, unemotional detail the cold-blooded torture and murder of 10 people, including a 9-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl. "We couldn't shut him up," the police said. Rader talked about his crimes and a host of other subjects in no particular order, according to the lieutenant, and he was easily manipulated by his interrogators, feeding of his incredible egoism. In fact, he displayed such an infatuation with himself that he seemed to believe the police were his friends. Rader got so comfortable during the interview that at one point he told a police officer to put BTK on the lid of his drinking cup before putting it in the refrigerator. Look at how the mind of this man works. Lieutenant says the case taught him not to be shy about seeking outside help. He singles out the efforts of 2 agents from the FBI Academy's Behavioral Analysis Unit who helped devise an overall strategy for dealing with BTK. The agents not only created a personality profile of the killer, but also offered the task force ongoing advice on how to keep the suspect talking without antagonizing him further. They also recommended that one person, the lieutenant, be the designated go-between, helped him write his prepared remarks in response to BTK's communications, and even suggested questions to ask Rader during his interrogation. The lieutenant then said, "We stuck to the plan we set up and eventually worked because Rader got caught up in his own game and ended up giving himself away." FBI officials refused to make the 2 agents available for interviews, citing the possibility they could be called as witnesses in several pending civil suits against Rader by the families of some of his victims. But 2 former FBI agents who profiled BTK, both experts in the areas of criminal profiling and violent sexual offenders, say Rader is a lot like other serial killers in some ways, but not in others. Retired FBI agent Roy Hazelwood, one of the agency's original profilers, and now a researcher, teacher, and private consultant, says Rader may be the most fascinating serial killer he has ever studied. While most serial killers exhibit at least one type of paraphilic behavior or sexual deviation, Hazelwood says Rader has at least 7, the most he's ever seen in one person. Rader also has at least 2 personality disorders, narcissism and psychopathy, that are common among serial killers, including Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and David Berkowitz, also known as Son of Sam. In layman terms, Hazelwood says, that means Rader has, among other things, an exaggerated sense of self, a lack of empathy for others, and no feelings of guilt, remorse, or fear. Unlike most serial killers, however, Rader went on a spree that lasted an unusually long time. He started killing in 1974 when he was 29 and was planning another murder at the time of his arrest when he was 59. Also unusual for a serial killer, Hazelwood said, was the amount of time that passed between his crimes. Most serial killers kill more frequently than he did. Spotsylvania, Virginia-based criminologist Robert Ressler, another retired FBI profiler, believes that Rader may be responsible for more than the 10 killings that have been attributed to him. Another unusual feature of Rader's crimes, according to Hazelwood, is that he communicated so much and so frequently with the police and the media. Rader sent 19 messages in all, 10 of them in the 11 months before his arrest. Most serial killers do not communicate with the authorities, and when they do, it is hardly ever to the extent that Rader did. Hazelwood also finds it odd that Rader interacted with and seemed to trust the lieutenant so completely, which he attributes to Rader's feelings of superiority and invulnerability. Hazelwood, who profiled BTK as an FBI agent in 1984, got some things right and others wrong. He said then, for instance, that BTK had fantasized about committing sadistic acts as a child, had an interest in psychology and criminology, and was an outdoorsman, all of which turned out to be true. But he also said that BTK was articulate, had likely been interviewed by and been cooperative with the task force, and was probably known to the operator of an adult bookstore in the area, all of which proved to be incorrect. Ressler says that Rader, like many serial killers, is a sexual sadist with a vivid fantasy structure. Rader also shares another character trait with many serial killers. Rader also manifests the common serial killer desire to be involved in law enforcement, according to Ressler, and when he couldn't become a cop for one reason or another, he got a job as a code compliance officer, which allowed him to carry a badge and gave him authority over other people, as well as access to their homes. Ressler, who was able to view some of BTK's early communications as an agent in the late 70s, says it was evident that the killer had a strong interest in the criminal justice system because he was so well versed in the details of other serial killings. Ressler, who also profiled the killer at the time, theorized that BTK was a young, unmarried man who was pursuing a career in law enforcement, which, except for Rader's marital status, turned out to be essentially correct. Rader's creation of a secret symbol to authenticate his communications with the police, while unusual, was taken directly from Berkowitz, who drew an occult symbol on one of his letters to the media, Ressler says. But unlike Hazelwood, Ressler says BTK's penchant for communicating with the police and the media is typical of serial killers, whose egos tend to be so fragile they seek attention for their crimes. To make that point, Ressler cites a passage from one of BTK's letters in which he asked, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" Ressler says, "How plain can you get in your cry for attention?" And he wouldn't have been planning another murder when he was arrested, as he acknowledged doing in his confession, nor would he have realized his grand scheme, also voiced during his confession, to write a book about BTK, place it in a safe deposit box under an assumed name, and have it discovered after his death. The beginning of the end for BTK came in January 2005 when he sent a postcard to a Wichita TV station describing a package he claimed to have left by the side of the road. In the message, BTK also asked about the status of another package he said he had left at a Home Depot store a few weeks earlier. The roadside package turned out to be a cereal box containing a document. It described in gruesome detail his first crime, the 1974 murders of a couple and 2 of their 5 children. The box also held some jewelry and a doll with a rope around its neck. The doll was tied to a curved PVC pipe, apparently representing one of the victims, an 11-year-old girl. But it was BTK's reference to a package at the Home Depot that gave police their first big break in the case. An initial search of the premises turned up nothing from BTK, but a store employee told police that his girlfriend had found a cereal box with writing on it in the bed of his pickup truck about 2 weeks earlier. That employee, thinking it was a joke, threw the box away. Police recovered the trash and found the box, which contained several documents, including the one asking police whether BTK could communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced. If so, he asked police to place a newspaper ad saying, "Rex, it will be okay." 2 weeks later, a disc arrived in the mail at another TV station, along with a gold chain, a photocopied cover of a novel about a killer who bound and gagged his victims, and several 3x5 index cards, one of which gave instructions for communicating with BTK through the newspaper. The lieutenant says Rader had taken pains to delete any identifying information from the disk, but he made the fatal mistake of taking the disk to his church to print out the file because the printer for his home computer wasn't working. It's pretty basic stuff, he said about the reconstruction of the deleted information. Anybody who knows anything about computers could figure it out. A simple internet search turned up a website for the church which identified Dennis Rader as president of the congregation. Police quickly determined that Rader was a code compliance officer in Park City. Located his address, drove past his house and saw a black Jeep Grand Cherokee registered to his son Brian in the driveway. From there, prosecutors subpoenaed a tissue sample from a pap smear done on Rader's daughter Carrie at a student clinic near Kansas State University in Manhattan, which she had attended 5 years earlier. DNA tests on that sample showed that Carrie Rader was the daughter of BTK. Any lingering doubts were erased after Rader's arrest, when he proudly described in bone-chilling, matter-of-fact way the torture and murder of 10 people, including the 11-year-old girl and 9-year-old boy. His recorded confession, which lasted more than 30 hours, filled 17 DVDs. After his arrest, Rader also directed police to what he called his mother lode, a drawer in a locked file cabinet at his City Hall office where he kept newspaper clippings about the case, copies of all his communications, photographs, and other mementos of his victims, and several chapters of the book he was writing, which he called the BTK story. Sedgwick County Deputy District Attorney Kevin O'Connor, one of the 3 prosecutors in the case, says the evidence against Rader was overwhelming. O'Connor says, "We had the DNA, we had his confession, and we had the so-called mother lode. This case was airtight. When a computer user deletes data from a floppy disk, the data itself doesn't disappear. While the link to the data disappears, the data itself remains on the disk until it is overwritten with new data. It's the electronic equivalent of removing a card from the card catalog at the library. The card may be gone, but the book is still there. A more sophisticated user could probably do a better job of covering its tracks, but a qualified expert with the right set of tools can usually follow even the savviest user electronic trail almost to the point of the original iron molecules." But O'Connor says police and the lieutenant in particular deserve a lot of credit for bringing the case to a successful conclusion. They collected and preserved DNA evidence when nobody knew anything about DNA. They kept BTK communicating, knowing that he may eventually slip up. They resisted pressure to test the DNA evidence they had until they had a suspect to compare it with, and they figured out a way to get a profile of Rader's DNA without tipping him off that they were zeroing in on him as a suspect. Dennis Rader, now 75, continues to live out his sentences in solitary confinement at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, Kansas. Rader's story inspired the Stephen King novella A Good Marriage, which was published as part of the 2010 collection Full Dark, No Stars, and later became a feature film. In 2016, forensic psychology professor Catherine Ramsland published Confessions of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, which revealed that the notorious murderer had planned to claim an 11th victim before he was arrested. In October 2017, Netflix crime drama Mindhunter was released to critical acclaim. One of the serial killer characters, known as ADT Man on the show, is based on Rader. Thank you for listening to another episode of the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. Share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TrueCrimeNS, or find us on Facebook and like us at facebook.com/TrueCrimeNeverSleeps, or just search for True Crime Never Sleeps.
Thank you for listening to the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. Follow us on Twitter at TrueCrimeNS. Like us on Facebook at True Crime Never Sleeps. Tune in next week for an all-new episode.